The views expressed in this interview are those of the individuals and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome to the Trident Room, brewer of stout conversation, unfiltered and on tap. On today's episode, Commander Matthew Morris and Lieutenant Cortni Thrasher are invited to the Academic Arsenal series, where they share with us their current academic efforts here at MPS and delve into their thesis adventure. Welcome to our first episode of a new series that we're calling our Academic Arsenal, where we sit down with MPS students and speak about what their thesis journey has been, what they're researching, and how that might impact them in the future. So thank you, Matthew. We're sitting down with Commander Matthew Morris, and he's going to step us through all of his efforts for the past few years. So if you wouldn't mind, would you give a brief background of who you are, your career, the program you're in here at MPS, and when you graduating?
Thank you for having me, Alanna. Commander Matthew Morris. I commissioned back in 2009 as a surface warfare officer. Did that through OCS. Did 2 tours as a surface warfare officer, first on a DDG out of Yokosuka, where I was the communications officer. And then I was with PCC Hotel on USS Hurricane and Chinook before they finally settled on USS Zephyr, which is since decommissioned. I put in a lat transfer package to information professional after that, mostly because of the amount of exposure I had to Navy networks and ComSec. I just found it was a very niche area to be in that not a lot of people knew a lot about. And because of my exposure, I was like, well, maybe this is something I could make a career out of. As an IP, I went to COMDESRON 9 and deployed on USNS Mercy and with the USS Nimitz Strike Group. Then did a tour at OpNav, working coalition and allied interoperability. Then my 04 milestone was with Carrier Strike Group 9 with the Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group. And then I came here briefly before I was a student. I worked in cybersecurity, and then I've been in the network operations and technology curriculum for the past 2 years, and I will be graduating here in just over 2 weeks.
Wow, that is quite the career across the globe. And then you're going back out to Japan after graduation.
Yes, I'll be joining the USS GEORGE WASHINGTON as the combat systems officer, and we'll be executing part of the home port shift out to Yokosuka, where they'll be taking over for the Ronald Reagan, who's been out there for a while.
Wow. All right. Thank you very much. So with your time here at MPS coming to a close, can you give us a brief summary of your thesis topic and what it all encompasses?
Sure. As I mentioned, a lot of exposure with Navy networks. I actually had a friend of mine who you know as well, Lieutenant Commander Will Tuman.
Yes. Will.
Who graduated 2 years ago. He and his thesis partner, Nicole Samilla, were working on how do we do better with our existing networks? That is, how do we ensure that the most important data is moving the fastest on and off the ship through quality of service, or QoS? They were able to do a lot of research and develop a plan to test some recommended changes to our QoS policies to help better enable warfighters operating when our communications aren't so great. So my thesis partners, Lou Bonch and Ken Stout, and I took that all on from them, kept them as our, in our pocket for the first part of our thesis. And we started trying to find avenues to actually conduct experimentation, said, how do we know if this is actually better than the way we normally do things?
Right.
Kind of pulled the thread on that for a while, and we found that with all of the new technologies that are coming out to ships, that we needed to kind of shift away from quality of service and look more holistically at all right, there's all this new technology that's coming out, specifically looking at software-defined networking and communications as a service, all coming in as part of the next iterations of our Navy networks through Overmatch, and said, all right, how do we implement this in the best way to support the warfighter? Again, looking at those critical services for conducting assured command and control. It was a big problem, and we decided to divide it up into 3 different sections. So Lou was looking at the technologies, specifically going all the way back to ForceNet and early Navy networks afloat, all the way through things like IT-21 and Canes, and now looking at the future. I looked at it from the tactical perspective, specifically as an information warfare tactics instructor, said, all right, here are the tactics that we use now, and if I apply this to the new technologies, what needs to be baked into the process to ensure that our warfighters are being served at the operational edge? And then Ken said, all right, the technology's there. We have this idea of tactics. All right, what is the policy that needs to be put in place at the Navy level to support training and ensuring that there's documentation to support our sailors that are going to be actually operating these networks? Because when we looked at it, it wasn't just that our networks are all these tech refreshes. I think people think about, oh, you get new computers, great, they're going to be a little bit faster. But this is an evolution of the network saying, like, all right, communications as a service isn't just looking at satellite communications, it's also looking at our terrestrial communications through services like Battle Force Tactical Network, BFTN, and saying, all right, well, if I have a ship that I can communicate over a terrestrial radio and I'm going to send them an email or whatever product I would be using to communicate directly with them, why would that have to go through our SATCOM? And why would it have to go to a shore station and then come right back to the ship that's 10 miles away from me when I could just go from ship to ship? So rather than worrying about these tiny pipes that we've been accustomed to, a destroyer gets about 3 megabits per second on SHF, that's not very much for 300 people to be sharing. Home, I get 500 megabits per second,
Right,
and it's just
just
my
on
wife
your
and I.
Wi-Fi, yeah.
Exactly. So trying to free up some of that space just by being smarter about how we route traffic. That's kind of how we were taking the approach.
Gotcha. Okay. So just to kind of emphasize what you were saying is that I mean, my personal journey through NPS, I did my own thesis. I was able to do my own research, do my own efforts, do my own writing, but you had to work in a team. This is a team thesis with at least 3 other people right now, but you've also brought in multiple other aspects that have a hand in this thesis. So you've had to coordinate and communicate through all of that as well. Would you say that's your biggest challenge, or were there other challenges that you had to overcome?
So initially we had a lot of issues, just like I mentioned with the experimentation we were trying to do with the quality of service stuff up front. Finding a lab that could support the experimentation and personnel outside of the NPS organization that would be needed to support that became incredibly challenging, because on the totem pole of, where does everything rack and stack as far as priorities, NPS research for these 3 students that are just trying to do this experimentation was pretty low compared to operational, new systems that are already being pushed out to the fleet, like making sure that those actually work. Our time frame for that, we tried to give ourselves enough time to say, hey, if we can't do it in the summer of 2023, we can do it all the way up until the beginning of 2024 and still have enough time to do the experimentation and then conduct analysis on the back end to say yay or nay that this proposal works. It just wasn't happening for us. And we said, all right, well, we've already developed this great rapport with NAVWAR and NIWIC and the Project Overmatch team. I have all these contacts over at NIWIC on the East Coast. We already know what we're talking about here, and we already know all these other things are coming down the line. So how can we help shape the development of these new technologies and ensure that the right stakeholders are involved at the right time to ensure that this is a successful deployment of this new technology? And part of that was we've gotten used to Navy networks. And I think a lot of on the IT side and on the information professional side, we get a lot of flack for CANES when that came out to the fleet. And the Consolidated Afloat Network Enterprise Services. That's the most recent networks that we deployed to ships. And I think there's a lot of greatness that came out of that, but a lot of sailors have a lot of challenges when they transition to a new network architecture. How does that work and what does it mean? Because I know when I joined the Navy and even the few years before then, it was kind of the Wild West with networks, and there was a lot of Frankensteining of networks where you didn't really know what your baseline was. You didn't know what it was supposed to be. And every ship was different. CANES was supposed to try and make everything a bit more uniform between the different variants of ships. And I think it did a better job of that and helped us with streamlining the training. But over the last 10 years or longer now, as you continue to instantiate that technology, there's new schools, the NEC has changed and it becomes more of a challenge. And I know
And NEC is?
Navy Enlistment Classification Code.
I think so, yeah. Basically kind of a number code that determines your schooling.
Yeah, it's what is your aptitude to be able to work on the system? And if you have earned an NEC through going through schools, that just says, hey, this person is qualified based on having the right background, both on rank and training to do this.
Perfect.
I think on our end, we're trying to get ahead of the curve with the software-defined networks and communications as a service and trying to say, all right, we might know a little bit about the stuff that happened in the past. I mean, Lou and Ken are prior enlisted, and so they've got more time in than I do. and they kind of remember what it was like, I'll say back in the day, but we've all been in long enough that we've seen a lot of this evolution of networks and sort of have an idea of maybe we don't do it that exact way again, or here's what did work and here's how we need to look at those examples to ensure that the future stuff is good too.
When you did all this and you did your research and were finally able to get your results, were they what you expected them to be? When you hypothesized what your vision was going to be, what this new network or this new optimization looked like, did your results support that?
I would argue that our proposal looks nothing like what we actually end up turning in because it changed so much. I think that we went in with a lot of skepticism with how communications as a service and software-defined networks were going to work, but we got very excited the more we read about it, how industry has already been using this for a long time. Now the Navy's getting on board with it because we're not like a lot of the other services where you have a board base and you deploy from there. So when we get underway, we bring our networks with us and it stays with us the entire time. And you got to remember that on our small ships, you have a fraction of the data rate that you have at your home. You're getting less and you're sharing it with hundreds of people when you're on deployment. So as we pulled the thread, we talked to the folks at Overmatch, we talked to the folks at IWTI, and the people who are doing the research and actually doing the experimentation and testing on there. And we got a lot more excited for it. And the nice thing is that it's not even that this is coming down the line in 10 years. This is something that is being instantiated and brought on ships already. So we're seeing it in the fleet. The Nimitz Strike Group had it. I believe the Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group had it on their most recent deployment. And we got a lot of feedback from that. And even with the inclusion of the proliferated low Earth orbit satellite constellations like Starlink being incorporated in this as well, it's got a lot of promise and we're pretty excited about it. While I would say our analysis is more optimistic but cautious right now, only because I approached it with that tactical lens. I said, all right, this is all fine and good, but when things happen and the weather's bad and the network goes down or you lose your connection to the satellite, can we still do the job? And that's kind of what I focused on for my portion of the thesis. And I said, with technology being as it is, and the more automation you include in it, it has these pros and cons to it. So here's my recommendations for ensuring that we maintain assured command and control throughout, regardless of how much throughput the ship has at any given time.
Okay, awesome. Lastly, was there any part of your experience here through your entire NPS journey, through this thesis and working with all these different entities and different people, and then seeing the results and how they're going to benefit the fleet? What was your favorite part through that entire thing and why?
We had a lot of struggles, as I mentioned early on, with trying to get people excited about the thesis and trying to do this experimentation. But as soon as we found one or two entities that were like, hey, I agree, this is important, and I'm going to send this to everybody on my distro list, like that's like the moment that really got us excited. Is like, finally, we found someone who cares about this as much as us. Exactly. So that was kind of a turning point for us, because even at that point, I don't think we gotten to the point where we decided, hey, here's how we're actually going to change this thesis so that it's a viable product at the end. But that's when we started building out our Rolodex. If anybody remembers what a Rolodex is, our list of contacts for all these different entities, and they started sharing publications with us and all this documentation, and we thought we had finished our literature review at that point, but I think we ended up with
more literature came in.
We had like 50 or 60 different publications that we cited as a result of this. Yeah, it was a lot, but it was all very rewarding and it made us more knowledgeable as a result. So I think just getting someone outside of NPS on board was the most rewarding part, because then it just cascaded into building of excitement. And I got emails from someone at NAVWAR earlier this week. It's like, oh my gosh, I got more draft documents I can send. He was like, well, the good news is we're almost done, but there's also all these other students in the program who we've talked to, and they might be interested in picking up the project. So even though we pushed out a lot of theory and suggestions for improving things, now we can also establish a track record if another student or students wants to pick up on the thesis.
Follow on research.
Exactly. Because, we come out with recommendations as well. And if they continue with that, they already have all these contacts who are interested, and we can help them along to ensure that they have that knowledge baseline. So they start at a higher place than we did knowledge-wise and can continue moving with the efforts.
All right. Well, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes to sit down with me and record this podcast, and good luck on all your future endeavors.
And thank you, Alanna.
Hello, everyone. This is Lieutenant Commander Alanna Youngblood, and I am sitting here today with Lieutenant Cortni Thrasher, and we are continuing the Academic Arsenal series. She is going to tell us a little bit about her work here at NPS. Hey, Cortni, could you give us a little bit of a background about who you are, the program that you're doing here at MPS, your career background, what you've done before?
Yeah, sure. I'm Lieutenant Cortni Thrasher. I'm an AMDO, an Aerospace Maintenance Duty Officer. I'm married. I've got 2 kids, 2 cats, a dog, the whole arsenal. I enlisted as an aviation electronics technician in 2012 after graduating with my bachelor's degree. I spent about 7 years in the Northwest. I worked on the Prowler. When it retired, I worked on the Growler, some components off of that while I was up there, and then I deployed on the Stennis. And then in 2019, after 4 long, miserable tries, the AMDO community finally accepted me into their ranks, and I commissioned through OCS. And after that,
When were you at OCS? What year specifically? And then, of course, what season did you get to experience while you were there?
I went through OCS in the summer, between spring and summer. It wasn't as bad as I hear some of the candidates who go through it in winter had it. I got there in May and I graduated at the end of July. It was kind of rough. It was the first time I left my son.
Oof.
I was a first-time mom and I missed Mother's Day a few weeks into it. But I was fortunate enough, the gunnery sergeant there were 2 mothers, me and a really good friend of mine, actually. He pulled us aside and let us call our families and FaceTime with our kids for Mother's Day.
Oh, that was nice.
And he opened it up to the whole class and he said, anyone that thinks this is unfair, speak now, but this is what we're going to do for these 2 mothers. So that was really helpful in being gone at that moment in my life. A lot of the people that were there were straight out of college, so it was tough to show that stage of life being mixed in with the military at the same time. But it worked out. We had really supportive classmates, so everything went well in that case. It was a lot different than boot camp for sure. In boot camp, nobody goes home. Everyone's together 24/7. But OCS, we got a bit of a reprieve because as an officer, they expect you to learn some things on your own. So after that, I went to maybe a month of school in Milton, Florida for aviation maintenance training. Just a brief synopsis of what we would do differently as officers than as enlisted. And for those who had never been in aviation maintenance in a squadron or I-level, intermediate level, I did learn quite a bit there, even though I'd had some time in. Then I was sent to Lemoore, California to be part of VFA 94. I was myriad of positions, but the most recent was the maintenance material control officer. We were in charge of the maintenance and upkeep of the maintenance department, so the 300 sailors that kept the jets flying, and then also the 10 F-18 Foxtrot jets. They're the 2-seaters, so we had both weapon system officers and pilots. I was there for 3 years. We deployed on the Nimitz in 2020. Which was long and rough. And then after that, I was there for their workups and their preparation, and I left the month before their next deployment on the Nimitz and came here to MPS.
And then what program are you doing here at MPS? And then when are you graduating?
So here at MPS, I am part of the Operational Logistics Management track. It's in the Department of Defense Management. It is recently been redone, the curriculum. It has a similar track as the supply chain management track. I think they are trying to tailor it more towards the operational logistics portion, but that's in the title, but less in consolidation and warehouse management and more in combat logistics or contested logistics. What sort of brainstorming do you need to come up with resolutions for those things? And that's more what those classes are being tailored towards, I think.
So you graduate in December, right?
December of 2024.
Okay, cool. All right. So with all of your amazing background, what did you actually decide to study as your thesis?
I picked part of a list of thesis topics from the Nimitz Research Group sponsored topics. Nimitz Research Group is a PAC Fleet sponsored research group that runs out of the undersea warfare. The department chair is retired Admiral Phil Sawyer in the undersea warfare department. And Admiral Paparo, when he was PAC Fleet, he is an alumni, and he thought that the students could help with real-world problems, not as near-term as they're currently working on and not as long-term as would be irrelevant once the solution was created. And so the different staff divisions came up with some problems or head hurters that were kind of on the back burner and provided them to the Nimitz Research Group so that we could take a stab at it. One of the ones that I chose was provided by N41, and I chose this topic last February before I had my daughter, and there were 2 of us who jumped ahead. One graduated in December, so he's already completed the first half of the research. research. And then I'm continuing on, but it is looking at amphibious aircraft in pack fleet in different areas where it could be useful. We don't use amphibious aircraft anymore, but in World War II, we used amphibious aircraft for everything. For search and rescue, we used it for replenishment at sea, we used it for rearmament, and there's a lot of really good, successful missions that were made possible through amphibious aircraft, and we have since left it in the history books. And so last year, the first half of the thesis was figuring out cost-benefit analysis and what different options, the either readily available or in the works aircraft, which ones would work better. So we looked at, there's a DARPA Liberty Lifter, which is in the works. It's in the research and development phase. They're still looking into it. It's meant to be, I don't know if you've seen much about it, but it's meant to be this massive, huge aircraft. Other things that are currently around, like the Japanese US-2 Shinmaiwa, which is, spoiler alert, what we ended up doing our thesis on. And then there's a Air Force aircraft. They're at C-130. It is in all of the branches, except for the Army. All the branches that have an aviation-specific department have a format of the C-130. So there's the MC-130 for the Marine Corps, KC for the Air Force, and the C-130 for the Navy. And the Air Force has come up with kits, like pontoons, that you can install on the bottom of this C-130 or KC-130 in there for the Air Force. And it can be turned into a float plane. So different as far as takeoff and landing goes, sea state, how much it can carry, but it is another possibility. So long story, they took 5 or 6 aircraft and they put them together. They did a Python analysis. They did a cost-benefit analysis, and it came out that the US-2 Shinmaiwa was both the most cost-effective, readily available. It had the ability to operate at Sea State 5. It could take off and land in Sea State 5, and it's currently being used by Japan. So we have something to look at as if we wanted to work that into our partnership and alliance, because that's one of the pillars that Pac Fleet already has with Japan. And in that area, it's one of their mission objectives. Do we want to bring on the components for industry within the US? Do we want to try and create part of it so that we can have a hand in it? That's what India is doing. India and Indonesia and Malaysia are trying to get a hand in creating this aircraft so that they can bring it into their own fleet. And so what do we need to do? So in our thesis, one of the acquisition tools that is used is, it's called the .mil PFP framework. It's an acronym for the following: doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, personnel, facilities, and policy. It's a good framework to see, okay, if we take this US-2 in, as Japan has done, what would it need to look like to incorporate it into our Department of Defense?
What changes, what little tweaks we need to make it work for us, but not Japan?
Yep. So doctrine, like, how do we fight the war? Just in general, a historical perspective moving forward. What does our portfolio look like for defense? How would the US-2 or amphibious aircraft fit into the doctrine? Organization, who would own it? Who commands it? Does it fall under an air wing, which is a smaller group of squadrons that travel with a carrier? Or does it belong to an area or a MOT, like a region or a COCOM? What does its organizational build out look like? And then training, we are using for our thesis the VRM squadrons that were recently stood up for the Osprey. We're using that as sort of a framework for us to look at the training pipelines, how the Navy works, new squadrons. How are they going to flow pilots in? Are we going to use fixed wing pilots? Are we going to use the reserves? Who are we going to pull from? Similarly, manpower, there's a business model that we're using to see, would we need to man this as a rescue jet built squadron, or would we need to man it as a permanently built squadron? And all of the questions that are in this framework are coming from both a perspective of peacetime and combat. So at what point does the Navy need to shift? Can you make it easily able to pivot? Or is it something that we need to, have a permanent stand and then have rescue jets? And so that's where we're at right now. We're past the proposal and we're now data collection and working on putting everything together that we've found and making it a composable thesis.
What part of that leg journey did you specifically focus on for your work? Which one of those letters?
So it's me and my partner, Lieutenant Commander Blaine Martz. He's a supply officer. And so currently, as far as writing goes, I am doing organization, part of doctrine. We're doing doctrine together. It's a big chunk. personnel for the manpower, just because I have part of my duties as an aviation maintenance officer is manning a squadron and working on making sure you have enough expertise and bodies to get the job done. So I'm working on that part as well. The international procurement policies is my chapter, but we haven't really gotten much on that yet. And it's really tough during an election year. I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges.
So that was the next part. What challenges have you had to overcome, or really what challenges do you foresee in getting this to the fleet or in getting this to your deadline for graduation?
Very good segue. Yes, I think one of the biggest challenges is defense acquisitions in general is largely intertwined with politics and bureaucracy and reform. There's just a constant cycle of, we're not getting it fast enough. It's too expensive. How can we make it better? Who's in charge? What do they want? What are the priorities? And so as a student with no program manager experience and only what I've learned in the classroom, it's very difficult to anticipate what challenges or studies or buzzwords this program would need in order to be successful in the fleet to make an impact. There's no use fighting that challenge. I think from our perspective, we would sit and bang our head against the wall if we tried to look at it from every angle. So that's why we've chosen the VRM squadron that was just recently stood up, because it gives us somewhat of a path forward. It is a recent squadron. It's a recent aircraft that the capabilities are newish to the Navy. Otherwise, we would be going in circles trying to figure out what the priorities are. Do we look at, what documents do we look at? What policies do we look at? Do we look at the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act? Do we look at what's happening in the real world? And so I think just removing ourselves from that has been the biggest challenge. Okay. Another challenge that was unexpected from the academic side of things was in the beginning, there was little interest because it was a topic coming from outside of the department. And so it was just new. It was a new thought. And I feel that with any research topic, when someone comes in and they say, I have this idea and it's not familiar, the buzzwords aren't there, it's a little bit more difficult to pick up traction. And so when we had come in, I was pregnant. I knew I wouldn't be back until next January. So I had a lot of difficulty finding an advisor who would come on board and say, I'll take this from start to finish.
So you kind of did it in a different way than a lot of students do when they come on board, or what I did, which is where you find an advisor first and then you decide what topic it is that you wanted to work on. But you had your topic first and then had to find an advisor willing to take up the topic with you.
Absolutely. And when we first checked into NPS, they told us, if you have an idea from the fleet, bring it in and you can solve it here and bring it back out with you. And I will admit, I had obviously help from PAC Fleet who said, this is the problem from the fleet. But yeah, it still was a little bit more tricky catching the attention. I had to first prove why it was important. There were a lot of holes poked in this topic, and a lot of times I found myself sitting back and a professor would ask, why is this important? Or I don't think this has any standing, or they've tried this before, they've done this before. And at the time I was, I don't know, PAC Fleet said it was important.
Yeah.
How do you manifest, I think this is a good idea, without putting all of this extra effort in that you might have to throw away?
Yeah, and time is time. I mean,
right? Especially pregnant or with a brand new baby. And
you had your family here, but taking your family out of it, you still have your program, and that's a huge commitment. I mean, I know for the METOC program itself, we're still doing the same amount of credit hours as a 4-year degree in 2.5 years. So I would assume that it's a similar time crunch for you in your program as well. And so not only do you have the family aspect of it that you're going through with a new baby, but you also have, how do I balance not wasting time per se, but how do I balance taking that time to convince somebody?
Being persuasive of something that I haven't built up yet.
With possibly nothing to show for it in the end.
And in what way do I build it up, right? And this is kind of what I was alluding to is, do I, for the advisors, each advisor has their own very specific portfolio of research. So initially, we had come at my thesis using, instead of the .mil PFP framework, we were using the IPSE framework, which is Integrated Product Support Elements. And it's similar. I won't get into the acquisitions because I won't be able to speak as eloquently on it. But in the multiple departments and sections of the acquisition world, they belong to two different circles of the Venn diagram. My acquisitions professor will have something to say about that. But anyway, it's not as formal as the .mil PFP process. And so with the help of our advisor, Ray Jones, he's the department chair for the Department of Defense Management, he suggested there are opportunities in Washington, D.C. see that you can go and sit in on the staff process of following the team that's coming up with framework for something in the future and going over these categories. But one of the biggest challenges, I think, once it got traction and people started kind of understanding, we were able to be persuasive and we were able to make our pitch about what we really wanted to do. The previous half of the thesis was solved. We knew exactly what aircraft was going to be best for the Navy. We knew exactly who had worked on it, where we could point our azimuth, where we were going. A lot of professors started to jump on board and had great ideas for us. And at NPS, it's difficult in a good way because you have all of these classes for different things. And you think, oh, I could include this in my chapter, or oh, I could include this on my business model. I could include this in my personnel chapter. And then you think, well, oh, maybe this person will want to be a second reader, or maybe this person could be an advisor as you're building. But then they come in with their own portfolio. They come in with their own background of research. And we were finding that there were a lot of professors who had varying paths of intention for our project.
Got it.
So we really wanted to maintain the integrity of what we wanted to do with it. So instead of jumping in and picking up an advisor who would work so well with us and had a lot of momentum for the project, they wanted to look at it from this color lens. And another professor said, oh, you would be able to solve so many problems from this perspective, looking at allies or looking at search and rescue or all of these different options with the US-2. And what we wanted to do was look at how the Navy needs to open up and how doing the .mil PFP format would make changes using amphibious aircraft again. And it opens up the ability to do search and rescue opportunities. What class of supply would they be able to carry? What would be best for the Navy? All of those breakoffs are useful for further research, but it's difficult to kind of narrow it down and hone it in for your own perspective.
So you had the challenge of keeping your vision of your project all of a sudden when your project became popular and other people wanted a say or wanted to use your project for maybe their own ideas, or they had ideas for how you could do your project differently or better, and you had to stay strong for that.
Right. We had to make sure that we didn't let it evolve too much before we could even do the research.
Yeah.
Because then it all just became hypothetical, and we found ourselves getting spiraled into a direction before we could even start. One of the two great opportunities that we did have, having some traction with our thesis, was that there's a new contested logistics lab that's being built in Ingersoll, and it's really cool. If you get a chance to take a tour, I would suggest it. Professor Harrison Schramm is in charge of it. It's really cool. But there were two separate visits to the school, one by Major General Revenflo and the other from Rear Admiral Mark Melson. And my team, myself and Blaine, were asked to present our thesis topic.
Very cool.
And going back on not letting it evolve before you get a chance to research, we were in the foundational phase. And so we're pitching these ideas, but it's so cool to receive the real feedback in the moment of those ideas to allow you to say, okay, it's either encouraging or discouraging this one specific thing to look at, or specifically in the event of the framework that we're using, it's so easily broken down into chunks that they say, well, where are you going to put the bases, or where can it land, or where can it fly, or where should the rescue jets be? Okay, well, my partner Blaine's working on facilities. That's something we can jot down now, and we can move forward, but still maintain that trajectory in the way that we wanted to.
Very cool. So I know that you're graduating in December and we have a little bit of time for these results to change, but for the results that you have currently, are they what you expected them to be, or have you found something that was completely just off the wall and surprising?
It's what I expected at the moment. I think it also goes back to, I didn't expect it to be very clean cut, only because the information that we're looking for is very difficult to get a hold of. So we do have networks through the Nimitz Research Group and our sponsors at Pack Fleet who have connected us with some aviation contacts from Japan, but it's still very difficult with times, and we are but lowly peons doing some research, trying to get a hold of information that we really have no business getting a hold of. It would be nice to have that information, but it's not detrimental to our research. But I knew it wasn't going to be a clean cut deal, but I wasn't expecting having as many resources as we do have, and it being as mathematical as it is. I did think that a lot of, coming from a fleet perspective, a lot of the decisions that are made in regards to adding a new aircraft, or where do you put the bases, or how do you draw the manpower out, a lot of those decisions from an operational view, I thought were not made in a vacuum, but made kind of how we talk and you brainstorm and you make a decision. But there are a lot of mathematical models and there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle that I wasn't anticipating having such a significant factor.
Is there anything additional that we haven't talked about in this last 30 minutes or so that you'd like to highlight now?
It's interesting doing work that you don't know this would help the fleet. I don't know yet. And unfortunately, the thesis sounds kind of bleak, but our thesis work is actually part of the Capstone Innovation Program, so it's meant to be continuous. So when we graduate, it's available for someone else in the Acquisitions Research Program to pick up. And unfortunately, when we complete our thesis questions and complete the framework, it won't tell us if it will help the fleet. It will just tell us how it can be integrated. Is it a possibility?
It can be used, but we don't know if it's going to help.
Exactly. Does it fit within our doctrine? Does it fit within the way we fight? I think as far as my perspective of helping the fleet, there would need to be 6 more months or one last thesis, right? Once we decide how to man it, someone else should look at what would be the sacrifice because we're not getting more people. So,
right? Yeah. Recruitment is definitely down.
Exactly. I can tell you my model says to pull 282 people from Okinawa and 48 people from Guam to man this rescue jet if you're in the Pacific with these aircraft. But it's not going to tell us how it will impact the places that they're pulled from. And we already know that manning is low. And so those sorts of questions I feel like would, when answered, help us in the fleet. I think ours is a very important and significant first step. So once the light is turned on in the room, you can walk in. And unfortunately, up until now, when it comes to amphibious aircraft, the light hasn't even been turned on in the room. And so I think that in that roundabout way, hopefully it helps and hopefully that the research has picked up. And I do think that it will make an impact.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending some of your time because, as we've already said, it's very precious. And we all know that time is money. So thank you for spending some of your time money with us today. And good luck with finishing your thesis and all of your preparations that you have for your next adventure.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us in the Trident Room. For more information about today's guests and topics, please visit the show notes online at nps.edu/Trident Room Podcast. The Trident Room Podcast has been brought to you by the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. For questions, comments, and suggestions, please email us at tridentroompodcasthost@nps.edu.